Mirror Force is perhaps one of the most iconic Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap cards in the entire game, but did you know that there's actually 7 versions of the card? Yes, that's true. So there's the original Mirror Force, which of course we're going to take a look at in today's video, but there's also 6 other Mirror Force variants, all based on different attributes. For example, we have Drowning Mirror Force, which is based on water, and then we have 5 other Mirror Forces that are based on the other attributes, and that's really interesting. And Mirror Force has sort of been this iconic trap card for so long, and I think it's worth taking a look at all 7 of the Mirror Forces and talk about what sort of impact that they had on the game, or maybe what impact they didn't have on the game. So let's start off with the original Mirror Force, the one that sort of lays the groundwork for all of the other 6. And when an opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy all your opponent's attack position monsters. It's pretty straightforward, and I think it is worth mentioning. It's sort of like a fun fact. Mirror Force actually doesn't negate any attack. This means that if you attack with something that's it can't be destroyed by card effects and your opponent flips Mirror Force, the attack still goes through. So Mirror Force, contrary to a lot of popular beliefs, it doesn't actually negate anything, it just destroys anything that would have the opportunity to attack. And this card was the only Mirror Force that's ever been on the Forbidden and Limited list. It was limited for a very, very long time, and it was also quite expensive. I believe that the first really big, really cheap reprint of Mirror Force was in the Merrick structure deck way back in the day. It had one gold series, well, it had a couple reprints before that, but none of them were super cheap until that Merrick structure deck. I remember as a kid being really excited to pick that deck up just so that I could play Mirror Force finally. And this card is not that bad. I mean, it's not super great in the context of modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but this card is so good in the whole history of Yu-Gi-Oh that it's hard to just ignore it. I mean, this card basically forced your opponent to say, are you willing to sacrifice your entire board on the chance that your opponent does not have Mirror Force? Because yeah, you could play around this preemptively by switching some monsters to defense position, but in some cases your opponent might not even have the Mirror Force, and now you've prevented yourself from doing some damage because you have a couple cards that aren't in attack position. So Mirror Force is sort of like the ultimate mind game card, and you know what? This card is so good just as a random trap card to flip up and totally catch your opponent's off guard. Maybe not so much anymore now that there's so many cards that don't really care if they're being destroyed, but when we look at a lot of the cards in this list, especially some of the latter printed ones, what they excel in is pretty much that you can catch your opponents off guard and totally decimate their entire field, which I think is really cool, even if the cards themselves aren't chainable to other card effects. Like you can't, if your opponent MSTs this, you can't flip it up to destroy everything, unlike a lot of the other good traps in the game, and that kind of makes them suffer a lot. They do have to be played in response, and also when you have multiples, it's not super great because you're likely getting rid of your opponent's entire field with the first one. But in general, the idea of these cards, at least, is sort of like the ultimate mind game as far as battle traps go. Now, moving on, we're just going to go in order of how these cards were released. So Dark Mirror Force is the next one, and this is one of the worst ones. So when an opponent's monster declares an attack, banish all defense position monsters your opponent controls. Now, why is this bad? Well, it's bad because it basically doesn't do anything. It doesn't prevent you from taking any damage. Very often in Yu-Gi-Oh, your opponent just won't have any defense position cards. It seems like the design of Dark Mirror Force is centered around the whole philosophy behind, okay, maybe your opponent thinks you have a normal Mirror Force, so they're going to switch everything to defense position next to the one monster and then attack you, and then you can catch them off guard with Dark Mirror Force. The fact of the matter is, though, that's pretty much never going to happen. Your opponent will likely only switch 1 or 2 of their monsters to defense position, if any. A lot of the times your opponents will just take the risk that you don't have the Mirror Force, and in that case, Dark Mirror Force just kind of sits there. Yeah, you can do some sort of silly combos by chaining Book of Eclipse to this card and then banishing everything, but in general, Dark Mirror Force has pretty much never had any impact, and it's pretty unsurprising when you look at the fact that these Mirror Force cards, these battle traps, are really supposed to prevent you taking damage or you taking having your monsters destroyed, and a card like Dark Mirror Force doesn't do either of those things. Moving on, we have Radiant Mirror Force. Now this was released, I believe, when Mirror Force was limited at the time, and that'll kind of make sense when we read this effect. So when an opponent's monster declares an attack, while they control 3 or more attack position monsters, destroy all attack position monsters your opponent controls. And why do I mention that Mirror Force was limited? Well, you can clearly see this is a strict downgrade from Mirror Force. There's no advantage to playing Radiant Mirror Force. There simply isn't anything better about this card compared to the normal Mirror Force, where at least in the case of Dark Mirror Force, while it might not be better than Mirror Force, it's different. Radiant Mirror Force is just a strict downgrade though, having all the same effects of Mirror Force except requiring your opponent to have 3 or more attack position monsters, which is definitely a huge letdown. While it might not seem ideal to use Mirror Force on just 1 or 2 cards, the fact of the matter is having the option is really helpful, and in that case, Radiant Mirror Force simply cannot help you. Radiant Mirror Force, just like Dark Mirror Force, because it's so bad, did not see any competitive play. Now moving on to one of the better Mirror Force cards, we have Stormy Mirror Force, and it's worth mentioning that the gap between Radiant Mirror Force and Stormy Mirror Force is, let's see here, it's 2007 through 2015, so we have an 8-year gap between these cards, which is pretty incredible, and Stormy Mirror Force is incredibly good and has seen competitive play. Why is it seeing competitive play? Well, Stormy Mirror Force is basically like a compulsory evacuation device for all of your opponent's attack position monsters. So when they declare an attack with any monster, return all of your opponent's attack position monsters to the hand. This card is extremely effective at dealing with extra deck cards, and that's pretty much why it's seen play. This card has also seen a sort of increase in play with Link summoning, because Links cannot be placed in defense position, and they really don't want to be spun back to the extra deck. So Stormy Mirror Force was a pretty popular side deck pick against any sort of deck that is Link spamming, simply because they just have to go all in, and in many of those cases, the cards that they're playing don't care about being destroyed, but they definitely do not want to be spun back to the extra deck. And in that way, Stormy Mirror Force is probably the most likely of all of these to ever be on the Forbidden and Limited list, although I think realistically none of these cards will ever be hit ever again. It's worth mentioning that Mirror Force is currently unlimited. And but yeah, Stormy Mirror Force is such a great card. I know I've played it in a ton of Paleozoic decks. It's just a really good, effective tool at removing all of your opponent's cards. Moving on, we have Blazing Mirror Force. When an opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy as many attack position monsters your opponent controls as possible, and if you do, take damage equal to half the combined original attack of those destroyed monsters, then inflict damage to your opponent equal to the damage you took. Now there's one really important ruling with this card, and that is that Konami changed how cards like this and cards like Ring of Destruction work. What I mean by that is that this card cannot make the match make the duel resolve into a draw. When you activate this card, if the damage is going to kill both you and your opponent, it actually just kills you first and then never gets to your opponent. Now that has changed since back in the old days, but ever since this card has been around, that is the ruling. So that's how we're going to analyze it, and in that way, this card's pretty darn bad. The only time this card is actually good or much better than Mirror Force is when your opponent has way less life points than you and you're willing to take this damage. This card has seen some competitive play, most notably against Cosmos. This card was a pretty good side deck option in Phantom Knight Burning Abyss decks against Cosmos, simply because you could do a ton of damage to your opponent and then summon Nightmare Shark, which is a rank 3 monster that can attack directly for 2,000 damage, and then you could actually finish your opponent off. But outside of that very specific scenario, this card has basically seen no competitive play. Of all the Mirror Forces, I think Drowning Mirror Force was one of the most hyped up ones when it was first revealed, and when you read this effect, it seems pretty darn insane. When an opponent's monster declares a direct attack, shuffle all your opponent's attack position monsters into the deck. This is way more permanent than the Stormy Mirror Force and is actually better against non-extra deck monsters. While Stormy Mirror Force is simply bouncing monsters back to the hand, which isn't terrible, you're really trying to use it to spin monsters back to the extra deck, and in the same way, Drowning Mirror Force sort of not only puts extra deck monsters back into the extra deck, but it also puts main deck monsters back into the main deck, and that is insane. Now, why isn't this card so much better than Stormy Mirror Force? Well, I would say that it's about even. It hasn't seen as much competitive play, but the big difference here is that for Drowning Mirror Force, your opponent's monster has to be declaring a direct attack. That's the only one of all of these Mirror Force cards that requires a direct attack, and I think that this card actually would have been overpowered if it didn't require that clause, but as it stands, this card is only good when you don't have a board, and in many cases, you simply can't wait that long. If you have no cards, this isn't going to save you. I would much rather have a board, protect my board, and use a card like Stormy Mirror Force to actually take care of my opponent's monsters and also keep the monsters I have. Drowning Mirror Force has seen some play though, simply because shuffling back cards into the deck is so strong, but I think in general, if we're going to look at the history of these Mirror Force cards, Drowning Mirror Force has suffered a lot more than the Storming Mirror Force, because Storming Mirror Force and all the other Mirror Forces don't require direct attacks. But I still think this card is very good. There aren't a lot of cards that actually shuffle cards back into the deck from the field. It's a pretty rare effect, and I think putting it on such a generic trap card is a cool idea, even if it didn't go so well in the competitive landscape. Now, the last one we're going to look at is another really good one. So that is Quaking Mirror Force. When an opponent's monster declares an attack, change all your opponent's attack position monsters to face down defense position. Monsters changed to face down defense position by this effect cannot change their battle positions. This card is insane and possibly the most popular Mirror Force card outside of the initial Mirror Force card, and maybe tied with Storm Mirror Force. This card has seen play in so many different defensive decks. Now, why is Quaking Mirror Force so darn good? Well, the reason is that this right now, if you flip down at like a Synchro monster, an Exceed monster, a Pendulum monster that was summoned to your opponent's extra monster zone, they now can't summon from the extra deck because their monster is flipped face down and they can't flip it face up, and you really can't use face down monsters for anything. Sure, they could tribute them, but not many decks are actually playing tribute monsters, which means for as long as you want, you can pretty much just leave all of their monsters face down, and as long as they have that extra monster zone blocked already, they can't summon anything that's too threatening, and Quaking Mirror Force for that reason is incredibly effective. It might not seem as good because it's not actually dealing with the monster, but if your opponent happened to have like 5 or 6 monsters on the field, this completely shuts them out. They basically have nothing to do until you actually initiate a battle by attacking their monsters and freeing up their zones, which means if you need to buy yourself some time, Quaking Mirror Force is the perfect option. So what can we learn by looking at these Mirror Force cards? Well, we can learn that 3 of the 7, maybe 3.5 if we're counting Blazing Mirror Force, have actually seen competitive play, which I think is really cool. Nowadays, battle traps aren't as important as they once were, which is why I said I don't think we'll see any of these on the ban list anytime soon, but I think they are cool tech picks for defensive decks, and I think what's really interesting is that because we have such a variety of Mirror Forces, some of them will pop up in competition for like one format and then fall out of favor for another one to come up the next format, and that's kind of cool. We don't see that a lot with battle traps. This is almost like a battle trap archetype, and it's usually just monsters that have the make up the archetypes, and they have spell and trap support, but this is sort of an archetype entirely comprised of trap cards outside of the Mirror Force Dragon, which we're not talking about today. But I think the Mirror Force cards are really cool, even if they're not super competitive anymore, and I think I would not be surprised if we see cards like Storming and Quaking and Drowning pop up in deck lists going forward. Anyway though, I will see you guys later. Goodbye.